Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. In the south of America, there was a peaceful town surrounded by a vast forest. During the day, the town was calm and quiet, but at night it was engulfed by an eerie darkness. On the edge of the town, in a small house, Sarah was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Everything seemed normal, but she somehow had a feeling that tonight would be different. Outside, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and a few bird calls breaking the silence were the only sounds. Sarah felt as though she was almost lost inside her house. She gazed out of the window and watched the leaves in the garden moving with the wind. The smell of the meat she was roasting over the wood fire spread throughout every corner of the house. For a moment, she thought of Tom. Her husband, Tom, traveled for work several times a week, and he was away again that evening. She was used to being alone. Tom often told Sarah how quiet the town was when he was away, and she would always laugh at his stories. It was well past midnight. As Sarah looked out the kitchen window, she jumped when her phone suddenly rang. In that moment, when everything seemed normal, she had no idea that everything was about to change. The light from the phone screen illuminated the dark room, and a name appeared: Tom. Sarah smiled when she saw Tom's name on the screen. But something felt strange. Tom didn't usually call at night when he was away, but maybe he had returned early from his trip. She found herself curious about the possibility of a surprise return. She quickly grabbed the phone and pressed the green answer button in the center of the screen. "Tom," she said, her voice mixed with curiosity and excitement. "How are you? Is everything okay?" There was a brief silence. Sarah could hear Tom's faint, strange, and slow breathing. "Sarah," he said, his voice sounding distant, hoarse, and trembling. This was not normal. Tom usually spoke calmly and confidently, but this time she could feel the tremor and anxiety in his voice. "Tom, what happened? Why do you sound so strange?" Sarah asked, trying to break the silence on the phone. "Don't open the door," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. "Don't open the door, please." Sarah froze. She was so shocked that she couldn't put her words together while listening to the voice on the phone. Her husband, who was always strong and reassuring, was now sounding terrified. "Tom, what are you saying? What's going on?" Sarah asked, clutching the phone tighter. "Sarah, don't open the door. There's someone out there." Tom's voice rose, for one last time before the phone screen went dark. Her eyes widened. A wave of fear began to rise within her, but she quickly tried to think logically. She wondered if Tom had said something wrong, or if perhaps the stress of his business trip was affecting him. Still, the strange feeling inside her was hard to shake off. "Tom, I won't open the door, but tell me more. What's happening? Why are you saying this?" she asked. There was no response from Tom. For a moment, Sarah was left alone in the silence of the phone. Then, the screen lit up again, but this time, instead of Tom's name, it read, "Private number." Sarah picked up the phone again, took a deep breath, and dialed the number. But no one answered. Slowly, with her hands trembling in fear, she put the phone back down. It was only then that she noticed a faint tapping sound coming from the door. Something shifted in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of it. Slowly, she moved toward the kitchen and took her phone out again. The strange feeling of the evening was starting to make sense. Something was definitely not right. Holding her phone, her eyes fixed on the screen where Tom's name had appeared earlier. She hoped everything would return to normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But Tom's voice, that trembling fear and anxiety, made Sarah realize that something was terribly wrong. "Sarah, don't open the door," Tom said, his voice trembling this time, more of an urgent cry than a warning. The pauses between his words, whispering, were suffocating the reality of his voice, but Sarah could still feel the impact of his words. Normally, Tom was always strong, calm, and brave. This terrified, unsettled voice was unfamiliar to Sarah. "Tom, what's going on?" Sarah asked, pressing the phone closer to her ear in panic. As she heard the deep concern in his voice, she thought that her husband was truly in danger. But still, her mind was confused. Tom talking like this told her something was terribly wrong. "Where are you?" Sarah added, her voice trembling. But it wasn't fear. It was as if the question made her feel misunderstood. She felt like something had happened to her husband, but she was still waiting for Tom to speak in a way that would reassure her. But Tom responded, lowering his voice even more. "Sarah, don't open the door. Please don't open it." Sarah's heart began to race. Tom's panic, the fear and helplessness in his voice made no sense. In that moment, the feeling that her husband was really in danger washed over every inch of Sarah's being. Slowly, she looked around the kitchen. It was only the sounds of her own that filled the room, but she didn't want to open the door, or even the window. Then she heard a faint tap coming from the door, and suddenly, a question mark appeared in her mind. "Tom, please, tell me something. Where are you? Why are you talking like this?" she asked. But all she heard in response was the static of the phone, like a choked sob. The trembling of the voice felt like it was stuck somewhere, but Sarah realized the phone was no longer receiving a proper response. "Tom, is this a joke?" she asked again, but everything was answered only by silence. For a moment, her fear intensified. Not getting an answer started to make Sarah feel even more uneasy. Just seeing Tom's number on the screen didn't mean he was there. His voice was fading, as if it were moving further away. Her eyes locked onto the connection lost message on the phone screen. Within a few seconds, the voice disappeared and silence took over. And then, the phone rang again. Sarah jumped. She quickly grabbed the phone. Tom's number didn't appear on the screen this time. Instead, there was a different number. It read, "Private number." She felt lost and confused again. "Who is this?" she wondered. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, but she pressed the buttons without an answer. The response came with a broken voice. "Sarah," the voice said, but it didn't sound familiar. It was deep, hoarse, and spoken in a foreign tone. Fear surged within her. But the voice was different from Tom's. "Don't open the door, don't open it," it said. These were Tom's words, but Sarah couldn't understand the source of the voice. The tone was threatening, but also filled with fear and helplessness. As fear slowly began to cloud Sarah's mind, she noticed her body trembling with a vibration. Everything about how real the voice sounded, how deep it came from, made each word feel significant. "Who is this? Tom?" she asked again. Her fear caused her voice to rise. The person on the other end of the phone simply responded by staying silent. As Sarah tried to make sense of this, she realized that something was definitely very different. The thought that her husband might be missing no longer felt far-fetched. On one hand, she thought her home was safe, but the fear inside her was growing. This wasn't just a voice. A danger could be at her door at any moment, and something was waiting for her. The voice seemed to be taking one step closer, inching toward her. The private number on the screen still wasn't responding. The unanswered call pushed Sarah into dark thoughts. Where was Tom? What was he really chasing after in that moment? And suddenly the phone screen went dark again. Sarah took the phone back in her trembling hands and answered, "Private number." She could feel her heart racing, a weight pressing on her chest with every breath. The screen only displayed "private number." Her eyes trembling, Sarah focused on the phone screen. Slowly, in a fearful way, she pressed the button and brought the phone to her ear. The voice on the other end began to sound deep and hoarse. At first, Sarah couldn't recognize the voice. It wasn't Tom's. It didn't sound familiar at all. It was like a shadow, rising from the darkness, a suffocated version of a voice. "Don't open the door," the voice said, words she would normally hear, but this sentence, carrying a threat, was enough to create fear. The tone was harsh and slow, but at the same time, oddly indifferent. It was as if this person wasn't listening to Sarah, just trying to say something. Looking at the phone screen, Sarah forced out the only word she could say. "Who is this?" She noticed the tremble in her voice, but there was a feeling deep within her that made her fear grow even more. Something was wrong, and it was real. "Don't open the door," the voice repeated, this time with a clear threat behind the words. "Don't do it." Sarah's mind was confused. Her heart seemed to climb into her throat. Was this a game? Who was this man? As the thought of Tom possibly being missing crossed her mind, she also started pulling the phone away from her ear. She tried to make herself feel safe, but somehow she couldn't put the phone down. This voice was gripping her, pulling her deeper into her fear. Every word from the voice seemed to shatter something inside Sarah. With each passing second, her unease grew more intense. "Who is saying this? Please bring my husband back to me," she screamed. She heard another sob on the phone but received no answer. The person on the other end fell silent again. Sarah briefly pulled the phone from her ear. She examined the blank screen, everything now a blur. Her heart was still pounding wildly, and her trembling hands gripped the phone tightly. For a moment, it felt like a nightmare. As she brought the phone back to her ear, she took a deep breath and, before ending the call, dialed once more, holding on to the hope of reaching her husband. The phone rang again. With each ring, her anxiety grew. Every second felt like it was bringing her one step closer to danger. The ringing with each sound whispered that time was narrowing, and every passing moment was pushing her further into solitude. On one hand, she began to feel the vast emptiness created by Tom's disappearance in her eyes. Something inside her was sobbing, and every new sound brought more fear. The phone kept ringing and ringing and ringing. Each time, the same voice did not answer. After a while, she heard the empty sound of the phone ringing, and in a moment of despair, saw again only "connection failed" written on the screen. This time, the fear and uncertainty inside her completely overwhelmed her. What happened? Why was there no one answering the call? Who was this voice? She hung up the phone, and her eyes began to focus in the darkness. For a moment, the whole town seemed to be silent. A stranger, as if smothering his voice, had vanished into the darkness. Slowly, quietly, she moved toward the window. As she looked outside, she felt that something had been lost within her soul. She had gotten lost in the thought that everything might be an illusion. She tried to make herself feel safe, but at that moment, a faint tap at the door made her realize that nothing was a dream. Someone was outside. Someone was approaching her door. Everything was suddenly real. Sarah froze for a moment after the last ring of the phone. Her fear deepened with every passing second. She had hung up the phone, but her unease continued to press down on her like a dark shadow. In that moment, she heard a strange tap from the door in the silence. A faint but distinct sound echoed through the house. She quickly turned her head in that direction. Her heart was racing, and her breath was short. The sound seemed to come right from in front of her door. A stranger was out there somewhere in the darkness of the night. Sarah suddenly felt how fragile everything was. The security of her home, the tranquility of the town. All of it had lost its validity in an instant. Slowly, she began walking from the kitchen to her room, feeling every step. With each step, she could feel her fear and panic growing stronger. Her chest tightened, and as her heart pounded, it felt like her hands were tensing. There was a cold fear spreading inside her, like a chilling wind. With every step she took, Sarah heard another tap in front of the door. It was no longer something lost. She realized someone was deliberately moving outside her door. The door was responding to any impact from the outside. She tried to control herself, but everything was becoming harder to resolve. She looked outside the window, but all she could see were shadows and movements in the dark. A foreign figure was vanishing within the darkness. Her eyes tried to follow every motion outside, but no matter how careful she was, the dark night always hid everything. At that moment, a strange thought clouded Sarah's mind. Are they watching me? Locking the door provided some relief, but with each passing minute, the sounds and movements from outside grew stronger. Her eyes stayed on the window, watching every silhouette that appeared, while she listened closely to another sound coming from the far corner of her room. This time, the source of the sound was much closer. Footsteps echoed inside the house. Was someone really inside? In fear, she quickly returned to her room and locked the door. Her hand trembled as she tightly drew the curtains on the window. As she pulled the curtain, the darkness outside deepened, darkening the inside of the house even more. In that moment, there was a coldness at the tips of her clicking fingers. The darkness grew in every corner of the room, penetrating everything, like a threat. She tried to feel a little safer, but there was a sensation. Her eyes were filled with unease from watching the window. A movement, a silhouette, disappeared again outside. Sarah became more and more uneasy, drowning in the thought that behind every reflection could be a stranger. She was starting to convince herself that everything was a trap. In the darkness of the night, she was like a shadow. Would someone come for her? At that moment, the phone rang again. Sarah felt her heart race before looking at the phone's screen. Slowly, she picked up the phone, her trembling fingers reading the screen as it displayed private number at the top. Her eyes momentarily went dark. It had almost drained all her courage. Who was this? What did they want? She brought the phone back to her ear. Taking a deep breath, her heart was pounding faster with every passing second. The voice on the other end greeted her again in that deep, hoarse tone. "Don't open the door," it said. Sarah's fingers trembled on the screen. Every time she heard that voice, it felt like her heart was about to leap out of her chest. The person on the other end continued in the same threatening tone. "Don't open the door. It'll be too late." For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to do. The movements outside, the sounds, this phone call, did they all mean something? When everything came together, it created a sense of defeat. But there was something more. Something was missing. Was it real or some sort of game? Or maybe it was a nightmare. As all these questions spun in her mind, she heard another sound, a single tap from the door. A stranger had appeared again in the darkness, but this time, his silhouette was clearer. A figure, just a few steps away. Sarah tried to open her eyes wider to look outside the window, but no matter how much she looked, all she could see was a shadow. The figure vanished in the dark, and in that moment she decided everything was over. Before pulling the phone from her ear, Sarah took one last deep breath. The screen of the phone still read, "Private number," but the tone of the voice had taken on a more threatening, deeper edge. Slowly, with every step, she could feel the fear growing inside her. A while ago, the deep and hoarse voice on the other end had made her heart race, but this time, the voice was more harsh and distinct. "Sarah, don't open the door before it's too late," the voice said. Like a storm, each word enveloped Sarah, but this time the coldness in the voice carried an even more intense, more repetitive threat than the previous ones. Each word hit her head like a hammer. She felt like she was about to fall into a trap. Her heart was pounding madly, and the tremors in her arms grew stronger. As she looked at the screen, she thought that at that moment, she had lost control of everything. Something was wrong. Something was going awry. A deep unease filled her, almost like a solid mass. This voice didn't feel like a joke or a simple game. There was urgency in it. It was as if time was running out, and with every second, she felt the danger waiting at her door, rapidly closing. And her eyes searched for movement in every corner of the room. She quickly stood up and in panic began checking the door and windows. She had locked the door, but she still couldn't be sure if she was truly safe. With trembling hands, she tried to make sure everything in the room was secure. The ticking of a small clock on the wall echoed in her ears. She moved quickly inward and closed the windows tightly. She pulled the curtains shut, as the darkness outside was becoming more frightening with each passing minute. Thinking that everything was secure, she tried to give herself some courage. But something was wrong. The sound was threatening her more, with every passing minute, increasing the fear inside her with every word. This wasn't just a simple call. The voice was creating darkness in her soul. For a moment, she silenced her phone, but with trembling hands, she checked the screen. Her heart was racing, and she was so terrified that she couldn't take her eyes off the phone for even a second. And then, just at that moment, the phone rang again. Without even taking a breath, she grabbed the phone. Her eyes were focused on the rapidly flashing screen. At first, she didn't notice, but the number on the screen, it was Tom's number. Tom's name was shining on the screen. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, and her heart raced. It was beating so fast that it felt as though every drop of blood inside her had suddenly stopped. Tom? Was it really him? She quickly swiped the screen, but she realized everything was quickly turning into doubt. The turmoil inside her was flailing, without pause. She remembered the fear and trembling in Tom's voice a while ago. Now there was only Tom's name on the screen. But this voice, she was so uneasy, she thought Tom might be calling for help because of some danger, or maybe a misunderstanding. She checked the screen again, believing that Tom had dialed the number, and opened the phone. At that moment, something was waiting on the other end. She took a deep breath and heard the voice, but there was a moment of silence. Everything stopped. A deep silence had intoxicated her. Her heartbeat was tightening in her throat with every passing second, her eyes fixed on the phone screen. How frightened she was. Every moment felt like the end was approaching. Then, the voice came, but it was different from Tom's voice. "Sarah," it said. But this voice was someone else's. A stranger's, deep and dark. "Don't open it, it's too late now." This time Sarah didn't even want to hear the phone. Slowly, her eyes left the screen and began to look around. Everything now seemed too terrifying to be real. Tom's disappearance, the mysterious caller's threat. It all felt like a nightmare. Her heart climbed to her throat as she felt frozen for a moment. Everything around her seemed to be turning against her. Who was behind this voice? Was it really Tom? Or was it part of the danger approaching her, a part of the darkness? At that moment, Sarah was left in the shadow of an unanswered question. Sarah touched the phone's screen with trembling fingers. Her heart was beating faster every second, and there was a fear lodged in her throat. When she brought the phone back to her ear, she suddenly heard Tom's familiar voice. But this was very different from their previous conversations. The trembling in his voice was strangely muffled, distant, and filled with fear, as if it echoed from a dark place. "Sarah," Tom's voice said, as if the words were forced out of his mouth. "I told you, don't open the door. I'm here." For a moment, as her eyes still lingered on the screen with Tom's name glowing, she tried to understand the urgency in his tone, but there were so many conflicting emotions, Sarah immediately sensed something was wrong. The tremor in his voice made her heart beat even faster. This wasn't the calm and controlled voice Sarah knew. Tom had always been steady and composed. But this voice, it reflected fear and desperation. "Tom," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. There was a moment of silence. "Sarah, don't open it!" Tom's voice now clearly showed fear. "Don't open the door, this isn't me, I told you, I'm here." As Sarah held the phone, she quickly scanned every corner of the room. There was something outside, a movement, a figure. But strangely, no one had knocked on her door. No one had come. Only a shadow was moving, far off in the darkness. She felt that something was out there in the dark, but at the same time it was becoming harder to believe that everything had just vanished like an empty ghost. Something was terribly wrong. But what was it? Tom's voice was blending with a buzzing sound in the background. It was as if the phone line had been cut off or there was some interference coming from somewhere else. The buzzing grew louder with every passing second. The tone of the voice seemed to change at any given moment. A different, deeper, darker voice mixed with the buzzing from another place. She turned her eyes back outside and saw that same, indistinct shadow again. A few steps away it wasn't very clear, but it was moving. A figure hidden in the darkness, vanishing in a way that couldn't be seen right away. Her heart raced so fast it felt like it would jump into her throat. As she focused on the buzzing sound in the background, she realized something. The hum behind the voice seemed to carry an unease, similar to the shadow outside, creating even more fear. A moment later, the phone rang again. Sarah dropped the phone and quickly scanned the shadow once more, but nothing was becoming clear. This shadow seemed to be hiding a greater threat behind it. She opened the phone again, but the unease inside her had grown so much that whenever she looked at the screen, she desperately wanted to believe that the familiar number, Tom's name, was still there. "Tom?" she called again, but this time, the tremble in her voice was a sign of much deeper fear. At that moment, the phone's sound echoed in a different way. For a moment, her eyes went black. "Don't open it," the voice said once again, but the strange hum was still in the background. Sarah suddenly stopped. There was something in that hum. Was it another person's voice? Maybe a phone trick but the voice was so real, it was so close. Yet something was off. She felt like something was missing from somewhere. "Tom, tell me where you are," she said, her eyes trembling as she held the phone to her ear. "Is it really you?" For a moment, there was silence. Sarah waited for an answer from the phone, but the fear inside her grew with every passing second. She felt like she was losing Tom's old calm voice. That voice, the familiar man, was now echoing indistinctly from somewhere else. At that moment, she didn't want to believe that the person on the other end of the phone was Tom. Maybe all of this was some kind of game, or maybe Tom wasn't anywhere at all. A few seconds passed. Then, the voice came again. This time it was even deeper. "Sarah, don't open it," it repeated. But every word she had heard before started to take on a different meaning. This wasn't a voice reflecting Tom's fear. It was the echo of another voice. And there was something in that voice. There really was something. A light bulb clicked on in Sarah's mind. Was Tom really there? There was more to this than she had expected. She was about to realize where Tom had disappeared to, and how he had fled without leaving anyone behind, without trusting anyone. They were chasing something. It was a reality, but this reality was nothing more than a greater threat buried deep in the layers of Sarah's fear.